All right, hey everyone, we're back and ready to continue our discussion of media institutions and their effects on political behavior. Today I want to talk through a couple of key concepts in this latter part of what I just said, the effects of media institutions and media practices on the behavior, on the sort of cognition of citizens. And when we think about this, we can really especially focus on kind of three key concepts in terms of the ways that media institutions can influence, have some sort of effect on the way that Americans conceive of politics around them. And the first one is this idea of agenda setting. We can think of agenda setting as the process of choosing what's news. So journalists actually have an incredibly important effect on the agenda of public discussion. And if we go back all the way to the beginning of the semester, we can think about Robert Dahl and some of his criteria for having sort of a good polyarchy. Dahl was talking in that sense about having access to control over the agenda. When we think about that, the fact that we have this free press that's able to have some influence over the agenda is incredibly important, because it's not just political elites that are deciding what's important. It's actually also these journalistic elites that are having some effect on this agenda by saying, hey, let's put our attention towards this issue right now because it seems like people are talking about it, and it seems like we would sell more newspapers, we would, get more eyes on the screen if we were to start talking about that particular issue. And so agenda setting, to some extent, if we think about the media as the sort of fourth estate of American politics, it's kind of a long-standing name for media institutions. They have this pivotal role in terms of communicating to elites and then also receiving messages from elites. They're an intermediary. They're a go-between in terms of bringing the agenda from the public to elites and also taking the elites' messages and conveying some of those messages and agenda-setting desires to the public. But media institutions themselves, as interpretive journalists in the modern era, also have this incredibly important role in terms of making clear what should and should not be news. And so, again, this is where a lot of controversy comes in, where a lot of people are critical of media institutions, and where media institutions can, for better or worse, start to play important roles in politics themselves. This is a very difficult job. So when we think about this, right, I want to get into this idea of media effects by having you consider for a second this kind of experiment. So let's imagine that 600 Baltimoreans are currently on board a cruise ship. Okay, and so I know many of you have probably taken a cruise in years past. Obviously, this year, no one's taken cruises, and perhaps that has something to do with this kind of experiment, right? So let's imagine that the ship's crew was contaminated by some kind of rare foreign disease, whatever it may be, and none of the passengers are sick. But of course, because they're on a cruise ship, it's kind of a closed system, it's very possible that people might get sick, and it could be very, very, very bad for those individuals if it gets out. So the ship has been quarantined, the crew is quarantined, and the CDC down in Atlanta has come together to propose some alternative possibilities to address the issue. And so they say that essentially we could do one particular program. We could go with one program that would essentially give passengers an experimental cocktail of drugs that will result in 200 of the 600 passengers becoming immune. And so that essentially they have 200 doses of it, but it has a 100% chance of people becoming immune. Program B, they have 600 of these vials of the experimental drug. However, it has a 1/3 probability of working, but a 2/3 probability of not working. And so scientists can only adopt one of these two programs. And so I guess the question is, should we adopt program A or B? Save 200 people at the expense of 400, or go with this other program, which has this 1/3 probability and a 2/3 probability that no one will be spared. So you can think about that, ponder that a second as we consider a couple more programs. And so in program C, okay, this is program C, what they have suggested is, well, what we could do is we could also send some kind of drone to rescue 200 of the people. We only have enough energy or drone batteries or whatever to bring 200 people off. 400 people will be certain to come down with this dangerous disease. And then program D is a 1/3 probability that nobody will be sickened, but a 2/3 probability that all 600 people will be sickened. And so the question is, should we adopt program C or D if we were to choose between these two potential options? Now, if you were to sort of go back and pause the slide and consider the difference between A and B and C and D, you'd start to eventually realize something that is actually quite important about this experiment, and that is that A and C are identical in terms of their effect on the passengers, and programs B and D are also identical on their effects on the passengers. It turns out that these two situations are exactly the same. However, what's happened is we've switched around the framing of this particular solution. So again, this is A saves 200 people, C condemns 400 people, right? And so you can see that really the difference is, the math is the same, the difference is the emphasis. Program B, 1/3 probability that all 600 people are spared, but a 2/3 probability that no one will be spared, versus a 1/3 probability that no one will be sickened, but a 2/3 probability that all 600 people will be sickened. So again, it's the exact same math, but we've changed around what we are talking about here, spared or sickened. And so this is essentially a very classic experiment that we've done with people, where we've actually had people try to adjudicate between these two different possibilities, for a long time. This specific example of this sort of rare disease setup on a cruise ship, this actually goes way back many decades. In fact, predates COVID for a very long time. So it's actually interesting that this, in a weird way, this framing experiment actually came true. But again, these are examples of framing that in the psychological literature we've actually done experiments on, by showing these people these stories and having them try to decide between A and B, and then we give other people C and D and try to get them to decide as well. And as it turns out, subtle adjustments to the emphasis and interpretation of story details can change the proportion of people who choose A versus B or choose C versus D, even though, again, those are identical in terms of the actual outcomes on the people on the cruise ship. And so when we think about the core motivation of journalists today, really we have to think about the fact that in the United States, we have a free press, again, due to the protections in the First Amendment. We also don't really have, with the exception of some marginal cases, right, a couple of different organizations, we do not have a state-sponsored press either. So, of course, we have PBS, for example, and C-SPAN receives public funding. But for the vast majority of sources, the government is not providing them with any money to stay in business. This is very unlike certain other countries. Like in Japan, you have NHK, which is a national news organization, or you've got BBC in the United Kingdom, which is, of course, supported by public funds. In the US, the vast majority of sources don't receive public funds. They are trying to seek profit. So we have a profit model in the United States. We have a private press. And their number one goal ultimately is to stay in business, because this is a very competitive media environment, right? These companies, again, they're media companies, are competing head to head to try to get as many eyeballs on the screen, or to get as many subscribers, or to sell as many sort of ads as possible. And one way that journalists can accomplish this important task, beyond just informing the public of what's going on, is to utilize framing. And so this kind of framing, again, allows people to compete over attention. So these journalists will think about just framing stories in terms of positive, negative kind of slant here. They can also think about framing stories in terms of what's the most eye-catching, what's the most attention-grabbing, what's the most interesting. And so this is, I think, another consequence of this kind of what we might call a libertarian press model, where there's very little government involvement in media organizations in the United States. It's more about competition on the free market. And that creates some incentives to engage in very specific kinds of framing behaviors. So again, agenda setting is choosing what's news. And that's a very complicated sort of political conflict, which involves elites, and it involves the normal, ordinary people like you and me, and it involves journalists trying to choose what stories to put on the front page of their newspaper or to lead with in their 60-minute news segment. Framing is a little bit different. After a story is chosen to be a relevant and important thing to talk about, we have to think about how we talk about it. And this, again, is where a lot of subtle differences can emerge across media networks. So, again, going back to this idea of the profit model, how do you manage to get a lot of an audience in today's news environment? Well, certainly you want to think about what your audience wants. And this is, again, one of the reasons why, those of us who think carefully about media as political institutions aren't necessarily thinking about a direct causal effect of media on citizens. I think a lot of people, ordinary people, will think about media and politics and think to themselves, oh yeah, those biased newspapers or biased news sources, they're just trying to sway audiences and try to influence them and try to change everybody's opinions, right? But if you think about it, there's a cause and effect story which has a bi-directional kind of hue to it, right? Do journalists cater to their audience, or are they trying to influence their audiences, right? Do they preach to the choir, or are they trying to change the way that people think? And so this is a really important question, this chicken and the egg kind of question about news media. Because again, if we think about it, framing is happening in news media in a way that tries to drive audiences to become more loyal to those news sources. We want to give our audiences what they want, essentially, because that will make them more predisposed to continue to click on our stories, to continue to trust us, continue to watch us, and to boost our ratings. And so, again, this is one of the ways in which niche partisan media has started to have an outsized impact on the media landscape in the United States, specifically because journalists are in these networks, specific networks, are seeking to capture niche partisan audiences, and it leads to slant. There's some really important kind of recent research that's especially looked at newspapers and has shown that actually it really makes a big difference, essentially, what your media market is in terms of the way that slant is created. So it turns out that preaching to the choir is actually a bigger effect, according to most recent media, on the actual content of media than is this effort to influence people. It really is, again, this idea that slanted media sources are trying as much as possible to retain their captive partisan audiences by feeding them what they want. And so, again, when we think about what's going on today with the news, we can critically interpret that as saying a lot of these journalists are creating these narratives in a way that makes their audiences happy. And again, it's not really about persuasion. It's really about doubling down on giving your core audience the things that they want. So they target individuals with pre-existing attitudes and they reinforce them. Now, another thing to think about is whether or not this is actually something that's been going on forever. Well, not necessarily, right? Partially because, as we saw, with the rise of the proliferation of news sources, there were more niches for these different news sources to be able to fill. But also, we can think about this idea that as an audience, as you're watching these news sources and you know that you have a vast variety of choices now, in the post kind of 1980s world, you're now able to learn which outlet is giving you the kind of media presentation that you like, and then you can gravitate towards them. And this is this idea of selective exposure. So, for example, somebody who would think of themselves as very conservative might be interested in gravitating more towards conservative-leaning cable media than would somebody who considers themselves to be very liberal. And essentially that's because they would turn on the television and say, oh, I don't agree with these kinds of takes at all, right? These kinds of opinions that are being said on this network make me mad. I'm going to change the channel, right? And so again, it's not about influence. It's actually about people choosing, self-selecting into their preferred media. However, there is some degree of evidence that people are exposed to a much more varied news diet than we would assume. I think a lot of people, when we talk about media today, come at this with the perspective that everyone is totally sorted into their camps, and liberal people watch liberal media and conservative people watch conservative media, and there's a few people out there who are, sampling kind of a range of different sources. But as it turns out, because especially of our social media networks and the fact that those networks are cross-cutting across ideology, it turns out that even the staunchest partisans do get exposed to some extent, incidentally, to news that does not fit people's preconceptions a lot of the time. So there are maybe some happy stories here in the most recent literature on this, but of course this is an ongoing scholarly subject of study and something that we're seeking to learn a lot more about in the years to come as we continue to ramp up really large-scale, really sophisticated studies of this particular effect. The last thing that I want to talk about today is this idea of priming. The priming is kind of the third of this tripartite or this three-part media effects model. And priming is something that is a little bit different from framing, but of course has a lot in common with framing. This is again a media effect, but it's one that comes essentially from not just interpretation of the details of a story, but really about the repetition of specific sort of key ideas. And so again, when you think about priming, I think the biggest thing to remember is repetition. Priming, repetition, priming, repetition. In fact, what I'm doing right now is I'm priming you to think about the word repetition the next time you hear priming. So it's kind of the example is itself, right? And so when media use very pithy, specific definitions of things over and over and over and over again, this will essentially affect the top of the head response model, something we talked about a few weeks ago when we spoke about public opinion. And so it turns out that this repetition of specific ideas, right? Priming, repetition. We say things over and over again, and we link these ideas in people's heads. They pop up involuntarily the next time we think about it. So when I say priming, you say repetition. And so again, this is very different from framing, because framing is more about highlighting specific interpretations of a story, right? Subtle changes in the way that a story is presented. But priming, again, is about repetition. And so priming, framing, agenda setting all have this massive effect, potentially, on the way that Americans think about what's important, what's salient, and what matters, essentially, in a day-to-day basis. We also know that this is a much more competitive, much more saturated media environment, and a much more potentially slanted media environment in terms of this wide variety of sources on both the left and the right of the political spectrum that exists now compared to the 1950s or even 1980s. And so we're left with a number of outstanding questions that we don't have clear answers to at this point in our studies. First, can citizens think for themselves in this environment? Or are they reliant upon journalists' interpretations to make sense of the world around them? Do we think that the media or media institutions are getting better, or are they struggling with helping citizens fill essentially their demand for useful information that they might take to the ballot box, or that they might take to Washington to put pressure on their elected representatives? Can media actually help citizens fulfill their democratic, sort of the expectations that we have for them as democratic citizens? Well, I guess I'll say that we might find out on a next episode of Poly 100. So hope you have a wonderful week. I look forward to talking to you in our next synchronous meeting. And until then, I will leave you with these intractable and difficult questions about media and politics. So long, everyone.